Good day, everyone. In this set of videos, we're going to talk about Chapter 6. This first part of the video, we're going to talk about files and the mechanism at which you actually save files to a hard drive. We're not going to spend too much time on it, mainly because at this point you should really have an idea of how files are saved to a hard drive. If not, there's plenty of materials out there for you to go and look at. Again, so this is just kind of a very top level view of that. So when it comes to working with files, data that we want to retain between our programs running, and to be frank with you, even sometimes when our programs are running, we want to save data. Maybe we don't want to retain that data in memory at all times. So we will make use of different ways, one of them including the ability to write a file to a disk. So typically, data is saved to a file, and this is typically on a computer disk. Now, when we talk about computer disk, oftentimes we kind of get that visual of the hard drive with the metal platters in them, and they're spinning. But hard drives come in different types. We've got both the mechanical as well as we've got the memory type, which is less mechanical. When you save files to the cloud, behind the scenes, somewhere in some data center, there is a hard drive that is saving that file. So even when you save to the cloud, even though you can get to it from different machines, it's still being saved somewhere onto a hard drive. If you save data to a database, again, somewhere behind the scenes, that data is being stored on a hard drive. When we save data to a file, we say that we are writing data to. That is the act of saving data on a file. The file that we create is known as an output file. This is the data where the data is written to. So the writing data to, that's the act of it, that's the verb. And the output file is what we've created. When we record data to a hard drive, think of your hard drive as a bunch of spaces, a whole parking lot of spaces. And when we store data, that data then gets written to each space in the hard drive. Once we've written data to the hard drive, we do want to use that data at some point. And so, like before, the reading data from is the act of retrieving data, where the input file is the actual file that we're going to read from. So reading data from the input file. To do this, we're going to do 3 steps. 1, we're going to open the file. 2, we're going to do some kind of processing. Now, this could be reading or writing or appending data to a file. And then finally, we want to close that file. It's really important that we talk about closing the file. This is a mistake that new programmers make all the time. And when you don't close a file, you will be leaving resources open. Sometimes that means you can't open the file that your program is writing or reading from. It could mean all kinds of things. So it's really good to get in the habit of closing the file. Now, in your assignments, again, it's pretty normal for you to forget to close the file. If you do, I'll make sure to notate it, and I'll have to take a few points off. So make sure you really try hard to close that file. Make sure you close that file. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. It's important to know that when we are using data in our program, when we set up a variable like we have here, these variables, they are in RAM at first. Then we can take them and move them to a hard drive. That is what we talk about when it is file output. File input is when we take the data from the file and bring it back into variable names. There are 2 types of files and 2 types of ways to access files. in general, we've got a text file, which is where we store actual text to a data file. What's nice about text files is you can actually open them and you can read them. The downside is they are very limited when it comes to saving data, as our programs often retain data in memory. Oftentimes, our programs have the data in memory inside of what we call objects. And saving that to a text file, we have to do a lot of conversion, not only writing, but then later reading. So the next type of file, the binary file, is well suited for that. The downside is you really can't open those files up and read them straight from like a text editor. Binary files can also be slightly faster when you're working with larger data sets than a text file. We will use some binary files, but for the most part, we're going to be using text files. When we're accessing that data between those different types of files, we can do it through a sequential access, which means we're going to read the file from beginning to the end. You can't skip ahead, you can't skip backwards, it goes from beginning to end. Then we have direct access. This is where we jump directly to where we want to read or write data and read or write that data right there. With this, we can jump backwards and forwards because, again, we're going right to the source, right to the place where the data is on the hard drive. Now, for the PC folks, most PC folks have a pretty good understanding that we have these things called file extensions. It is short, typically 3 to 4 letter sequence of characters that are right after the period. Now, they don't have to be 3 or 4 characters. It can be as long as they want, but most of the time you're going to see them as a very short 3 or 4 characters. One of the most common ones is text. That's a text file. Some of you are used to seeing DOC, which is the old version of Word. And the more common version of Word now has the X on the end. So there's our 4 character. For those that are using Macs, the Macintosh does it a little bit differently. You can save file extensions onto the end of the file, but it's not required. And the Mac doesn't pay attention to those extensions like the PC does. But there's a concept in the Macintosh that does the same kind of thing. It does help the computer know what type of files and what type of program should open those files. The next concept to understand is what's known as a file object. Think of a file object as a bundle of data and methods, which are a fancy name for functions. And in this object contains all these pieces. Now let's take a moment and let's think about this. So let's say we have an object that is a car. That car is going to have wheels in it. It's going to have tires in it. It's going to have steering wheel and an alternator. It's going to have doors and windows and blinkers and headlights and horn, all these pieces. And then on top of that, it's going to have a bunch of methods like dot, honk, horn. And when we call this, then this object is going to honk the horn of the car. Well, the same thing exists with other types of objects. And in this case, we're just going to talk about a file object. And in the file object, we have same kind of things. We have the ability to, first, when we open a file, it creates this object. And then we can write to it and read to it, and we can close it. And there are other methods in that object that we can use. But again, the important thing is when we open a file, it's going to create a file object. So when we take this and we open it, it's going to create this file object. And from this file object, we can do all kinds of things that includes reading the data, the writing the data, and the closing of the file. We're going to stop here on this video. And when we come back, we're going to jump into that step number 1 that we've been talking about. And this is opening the file. I'll see you shortly.